Sometimes, life feels like it conspires against you. Every day brings new challenges, new heartbreaks, new moments that threaten to crush the human spirit. For Michael Carter, life had reached a point where hope seemed impossible. Wrongly accused of murdering a man he had never harmed, Michael's life spiraled into a nightmare that would see him confined on death row for nearly 8 years. A man who had once dreamed of a future, of a family, of ordinary joys, suddenly found himself trapped in a world defined by concrete walls, steel bars, and a justice system that had failed him completely. Every tick of the clock echoed the weight of lost freedom. Every shadow whispered despair. Every day became a test of endurance. Within the oppressive silence of his cell, Michael found something unexpected, a small image of the Virgin Mary. A simple, unassuming picture that hung on his wall, unremarkable to any outsider. Yet, in a moment that seemed impossible, the image glowed. Not with artificial light, not with the flicker of reflection, but with a quiet, warm illumination that filled the small cell with a presence he could feel deep in his soul. That night, Michael realized something profound. Even in the darkest, most hopeless circumstances, hope could exist. Grace could find you where you least expect it, like a gentle hand reaching into the deepest despair. Meanwhile, Patricia, a widow living hundreds of miles away, was grappling with her own grief. Her husband had been murdered, leaving her to raise their 2 daughters alone. Justice had seemed to arrive when the real killer was finally caught, yet Patricia felt no relief, only the raw ache of loss. She had mourned, she had prayed, she had carried the weight of her pain quietly, but when she learned that Michael had been wrongly accused of her husband's murder, her world turned upside down again. Anger, confusion, and sorrow collided within her, leaving her uncertain where to direct her emotions. Who was responsible? Who deserved her grief? And how could justice ever feel real again? When Michael and Patricia eventually crossed paths at a community gathering, the encounter was unexpected, tense, and deeply emotional. Patricia, prepared to face the man who she thought had destroyed her life, found herself confronted with something entirely different: shared suffering, mirrored grief, and the startling realization that Michael had endured unimaginable pain of his own. He had lost years of freedom, endured the threat of death, and faced the judgment of an entire world, yet he remained compassionate, understanding, and profoundly human. This moment revealed a truth far beyond courtroom victories or legal technicalities. Hope is not simply an abstract feeling. It is a bridge that connects broken hearts, wounded souls, and lives that have been shattered. It allows forgiveness to blossom, understanding to grow, and even miracles to take place where logic and reason would insist they cannot. Through this story, we see that hope can be quiet, subtle, and persistent. It can come in the form of a glowing image, the whispered prayers of a mother, or the simple act of reaching out to another person who is suffering. The journey you are about to witness is more than the tale of a man freed from death row. It is a story of faith, resilience, and the extraordinary power of the human spirit. It is proof that, even when everything seems lost, light can emerge from darkness. Hope can inspire change, heal wounds, and restore justice. Over the next 2 hours, you will see how one life, touched by the divine and sustained by unwavering faith, can ripple outward, transforming countless others along the way. Even in silence, hope speaks. Even in despair, it persists. Sometimes, it arrives quietly through a glowing image, through a prayer said in secret, through someone who refuses to abandon you when the world has turned its back. This is the story of hope that refuses to die, of a faith that persists despite the impossible, and of a journey that proves, beyond doubt, that no situation is beyond redemption. Michael sat on the narrow cot of his death row cell, the gray concrete walls closing in around him like a cage. 8 years had passed since his life had been ripped apart, yet every morning felt like the first day of a nightmare he could never escape. The fluorescent light flickered intermittently, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. Every sound of the clang of metal doors, the shuffle of boots, distant shouts from other blocks, was amplified, echoing through the emptiness, a constant reminder that he was trapped in a world designed to crush hope. From the very first day, survival had been a delicate art. The guards, some indifferent, some cruel, monitored every movement. Fellow prisoners watched him like a hawk, wary of the label of murderer that had been forced upon him. In this environment, trust was a luxury, and any misstep could be catastrophic. Michael learned quickly that to endure, he had to balance appearing strong with hiding vulnerability. Every word spoken, every glance exchanged, could be interpreted as a challenge or a threat. He found ways to cling to his humanity. A tattered Bible became his nightly companion. He recited passages aloud in the darkness, words he had once barely understood now infused with meaning. They reminded him that even in a place built for despair, fragments of hope could survive. He also wrote letters endless, meticulous letters to lawyers, innocence projects, human rights organizations detailing the corruption, the errors, and the impossibilities that surrounded his case. Most went unanswered. Some were returned unopened. Yet each letter reinforced his sense that he still existed beyond the steel bars, that his story was not yet over. Michael became deeply attuned to the rhythms and routines of the prison. Roll calls, meal times, yard exercises, work assignments, lockdowns, all repeated with a monotonous precision that could drive a man mad. But he used this predictability to his advantage. He observed which guards could be approached, which moments offered privacy for reflection or prayer, which prisoners were dangerous, and which sought connection. In the quiet moments, he planned, studied, and fortified his resolve. The other inmates' stories wove into his own. Carlos, accused of murder during a robbery, had been abandoned by his family, and he bore the weight of rejection like a physical burden. Jennifer, convicted of killing her infant son, had found a strange peace in resignation. Their faces reflected Michael's own experiences: fear, anger, isolation, resilience. They became lifelines, reminders that even in a place meant to erase hope, human connection endured. Nights were the hardest. In the darkness, memories of his former life assaulted him. The faces of his family, the laughter that once filled his home, the dreams crushed by injustice all came rushing back. He learned to face them with discipline, meditation, prayer, careful reflection. One night, as he sat silently, he noticed a subtle warmth near the framed image of the Virgin Mary above his cot. At first, he dismissed it as a trick of the flickering bulb. But then the light deepened, soft and steady, radiating calm. They spoke of fear, resignation, and resilience. Carlos asked, "Do you really think miracles happen?" Michael's answer was quiet, firm. "I've seen them with my own eyes. Sometimes they come not as spectacles, but as courage to keep going when everything else fails." Michael's foundation began taking shape. Volunteers arrived, inspired by his story. Lawyers, social workers, and former inmates united to support those still trapped by injustice. He saw firsthand the cracks in the system, lost evidence, ignored witnesses, and bureaucratic indifference that condemned innocence. Each case required careful navigation, empathy, and tireless effort. During one particularly difficult week, they reopened Sandra Martinez's case. 12 years in prison for a crime she didn't commit had hardened her, but not broken her. Michael guided the investigation, coordinating with private detectives, forensic experts, and legal teams. Every new piece of evidence was scrutinized, every witness re-interviewed. The process was exhausting, but Michael drew strength from remembering his own rescue from despair. At night, Michael reflected on the Virgin Mary's image in his room. The glow was gone, but the peace remained. He understood now that miracles were ongoing, in small victories, in hope restored, in lives transformed. As he lay in bed, he prayed for the courage to continue, for guidance in helping others, and for the strength to face the endless bureaucracy and skepticism that came with challenging wrongful convictions. Over the next several weeks, Michael expanded the Foundation's reach. They visited prisons, offered legal counsel, and provided emotional support to families who had been silenced by grief and injustice. Every story mirrored his own fear, isolation, and a desperate longing for truth. And yet, in each encounter, he saw glimmers of hope. When he returned home, Sarah waited with a letter from a mother whose son had been wrongly accused. Tears filled Michael's eyes as he read the words of gratitude and faith. It reminded him why he had committed to this path, why he could never turn away. The past was never fully behind him, but now it served as a guide, a lesson, and a source of strength. Michael's story continued to spread. Television crews wanted interviews, publishers wanted books, but he remained focused on his mission, saving lives, restoring justice, and offering hope. Every day brought challenges, skepticism, and setbacks, but also opportunities to witness courage, resilience, and small miracles in the darkest corners of society. His breath caught. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of serenity. He whispered a prayer, uncertain if it was directed at heaven or at the fragile hope he carried within himself. Time seemed suspended. The fear, the anger, the injustice all receded, leaving a profound peace. He slept that night more deeply than he had in years. Weeks passed, and the glow returned intermittently. Michael shared the experience quietly with Carlos and Jennifer. Skepticism gradually yielded to wonder as small, unexpected events occurred, delayed letters arrived, minor legal mistakes were corrected, and unexpected allies emerged. These occurrences, seemingly trivial, were lifelines, reinforcing the idea that miracles could manifest even in places of despair. Michael also began to observe the prison ecosystem more closely. Violence and rivalry were constant, but he saw how fear and small acts of kindness could ripple outward. He mediated disputes, quietly diffused tension, and gained the wary respect of both inmates and some guards. Slowly, he became a figure others looked to for guidance, a source of calm in a turbulent environment. Then came a turning point. A letter arrived from a lawyer who had finally examined the case files. It was brief. New evidence may exist. We will investigate. The words ignited a fire within him, a reminder that persistence and vigilance could intersect with fate. He threw himself into preparation, organizing old documents, memorizing testimonies, crafting letters, strategizing for the battles ahead. One afternoon, Carlos confided, "No one comes to see me. I've lost my family. Sometimes I think it would be easier to give up." Michael recognized the hollow look of hopelessness. "You're not alone," he said, voice steady. "We'll face this together. Hope can find a way even in this place." Jennifer, serene and resigned, added, "I know I'm going to die for something I didn't do, but he'll be with my son. That's enough for me." Michael understood that hope could coexist with resignation, that human presence often mattered more than any legal outcome. The glow of the Virgin Mary returned again, more vivid than before. Michael realized it wasn't just a miracle of light, it was a manifestation of resilience, of faith sustained in extreme conditions. Each night, he prayed not only for himself but for others, for courage, patience, and endurance. The light became a symbol, a source of quiet strength that grew with every day of adversity. As weeks turned to months, the legal system began to stir. Evidence previously ignored was re-examined. Witnesses once silenced found courage. Corrupt officers were scrutinized. The prison, though unchanged physically, began to feel different, less suffocating, not because of walls, but because hope had taken root within Michael. He quietly mentored other inmates, shared strategies for survival, offered counsel, and simply listened. His calm presence spread through the block, subtly transforming the environment. Guards, prisoners, and even lawyers noticed. Michael's life, though confined, became a source of light, proof that even in darkness, compassion and resilience could flourish. Even as the death penalty loomed, Michael reflected each evening on the journey. The shadows of despair had been immense, yet he had found a way to endure. The light, whether divine or human, persisted. Survival meant more than enduring, it meant transforming suffering into strength, despair into hope, and isolation into meaningful connection. The glow above his cot continued nightly, a guide and companion. Michael knew the legal battle was far from over, but in ways that the courts could never measure, he had already triumphed. He had created a sanctuary within a place designed to destroy, proving that even in the bleakest circumstances, hope, faith, and human connection could create profound change. Michael had always believed that miracles came quietly, that they whispered instead of shouted, and that their light appeared only to those who had learned it to see in darkness. But as months turned into years, and his foundation grew from a handful of volunteers to a nationwide movement, he began to wonder whether the quietness of faith could survive the noise of the world. The Innocence Restoration Foundation had taken on dozens of cases. Each one was a labyrinth of lies, missing files, and decades of human neglect. The victories were rare but radiant, each exoneration felt like a sunrise after an endless night. But with growth came attention, and with attention came resistance. Powerful people did not like being reminded of their mistakes. Michael sat in his office one late evening, the soft hum of fluorescent lights echoing over stacks of case files. His desk was cluttered newspapers, legal briefs, half-empty coffee cups. On one of the papers lay the photograph of Jennifer Torres, the woman he had met on death row months ago. Her calm acceptance of death had haunted him ever since. Though her case was closed, her words "I'll see my son again" still echoed in his mind. He rubbed his temples, fatigue setting in. Outside, the city glowed in the distance, alive and indifferent. His phone buzzed. It was Sarah. "Michael, you need to come home," she said softly. "It's almost midnight." He smiled faintly. "Just one more file. You've been saying that every night this week." Her tone wasn't angry, just tired. The kind of tired that love alone couldn't fix. Michael stared at the wall where had hung the small framed image of the Virgin Mary, the same one that had once glowed in his cell. Now it looked ordinary, its colors dulled by time and dust. "He'll be home soon," he whispered. The next morning brought trouble. A major newspaper had published an article accusing Michael's foundation of manipulating evidence and exploiting false miracle stories for funding. The report was brutal, quoting anonymous prosecutors, twisting words out of context, and hinting that Michael's own exoneration might have been a fluke. Sarah read the article at breakfast, her eyes filling with worry. "They're going after you." Michael took a slow sip of coffee, his hands trembling slightly. It was only a matter of time. Within days, donations slowed. Some partners withdrew. Online trolls flooded their pages with accusations. The world that had once cheered Michael's miracle now doubted his motives. At a board meeting, tensions ran high. "Michael, we need a PR team," one of the lawyers said. "We need transparency," argued another. Michael listened in silence. He wanted to tell them that this was never about fame or funding. It was about lives. But in that moment, even he felt his conviction cracking. That night, he sat alone in the empty chapel of St. Augustine's Church, staring at the flickering candles. "Was I wrong, Lord?" he whispered. "Did I misunderstand what you wanted from me?" The silence felt heavy, impenetrable. For the first time in years, he felt the cold breath of doubt. Weeks passed. The investigation deepened. Federal agents raided the foundation's office, seizing computers and documents. News anchors called it the fall of the Miracle Man. Michael's friends urged him to lie low, but hiding wasn't in his nature. He continued to visit prisons, though now guards greeted him with suspicion instead of respect. It was during one of these visits that he met Daniel Reeves, a 19-year-old sentenced to life for a gang-related murder he swore he didn't commit. Daniel's eyes were empty, like someone who had already buried his own soul. Michael saw himself in the boy, the same hopelessness, the same anger at a world that didn't care. "You believe in God?" Daniel asked one day. Michael hesitated. "I believe in grace." "What's that?" "It's when you get something you didn't deserve, but needed anyway." Daniel stared at the floor. "Then I don't think grace is meant for people like me." Michael leaned forward. "Grace doesn't ask who you are. It just arrives." Their conversations became the quiet core of Michael's weeks. He brought Daniel books: Man's Search for Meaning, The Power of Now, and even the Bible, though Daniel only flipped through it out of boredom. Slowly, a shift began. Daniel started writing letters to his mother, the one who had stopped visiting years ago. He began painting abstract, chaotic shapes that somehow mirrored the turbulence inside him. Michael didn't see it as a miracle, but maybe this soft return to humanity was one. Meanwhile, the legal battle worsened. Prosecutors accused the foundation of tampering with evidence in an old case. Michael faced deposition after deposition. Every room he entered felt colder, more hostile. His faith wavered. One night, after a grueling cross-examination, he drove home under heavy rain. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and red through the windshield. He pulled over on the side of the highway, his breath shallow, his chest tight. For the first time since his release, he cried. "God, I can't do this anymore," he whispered, forehead resting on the steering wheel. The storm raged, lightning flashing across the horizon. And in the roar of thunder, he thought he heard something so faint it might have been imagined. "Then let me do it with you." Michael's eyes widened. The air in the car felt still, sacred. He looked up at the small medallion of the Virgin Mary hanging from his mirror. For a moment, the reflection of the lightning seemed to glow around her image, soft, warm, like that night in the cell. The next day, everything changed. An anonymous whistleblower came forward, an investigator who revealed that the accusations against the foundation had been fabricated by corrupt officials trying to silence ongoing cases. Within weeks, the story turned around. News outlets that had once condemned Michael now hailed him again as a hero. But Michael didn't feel victorious. He felt humbled. The miracle had been supernatural. It had come through courage, truth, and the quiet persistence of people who refused to give up. Daniel Reeves's case was reopened, and new evidence pointed toward his innocence. When Michael visited him with the news, Daniel's eyes filled with tears. "Guess grace showed up after all," he said, smiling for the first time. Michael laughed, a sound that carried both relief and reverence. Months later, at a conference in Chicago, Michael stood before a crowd of thousands. The lights were bright, the applause loud, but his heart was calm. He spoke not about miracles or media headlines, but about faith under fire, the kind of faith that survives doubt, betrayal, and silence. Faith, he said, is not believing when you see. It's holding on when you can't. He paused, scanning the faces before him: victims, lawyers, priests, mothers, skeptics, believers. I used to think miracles were flashes of light, voices from heaven. Now I know they're people. The ones who show up when the world walks away. The audience was silent for a moment, then erupted into applause. But Michael barely heard it. His gaze had drifted upward to the stained glass window above the stage. The light poured through it, illuminating the image of the Virgin Mary. For a moment, it seemed to shimmer. He smiled, not in surprise, but in understanding. The miracle wasn't in the glow. It was in the fire that never went out. There are two kinds of deaths in this world. The first takes your body. The second takes your meaning. Michael had survived the first, but he didn't yet understand that surviving doesn't mean living. Years had passed since his release, since the miracle that changed headlines and hearts. His name had become a quiet legend, the man who saw the Virgin on death row. For years, he moved through the world like a pilgrim of hope, visiting prisons, churches, TV studios, comforting strangers who wanted to believe that faith could rewrite fate. But something inside him was beginning to rot. At first, he ignored it, the subtle numbness in his prayers, the way his words began to feel like echoes instead of truth. But the emptiness grew. One morning, he woke up in his apartment and realized he hadn't felt presence, a divine or otherwise, in years. He still said the words, bowed his head, folded his hands. But nothing moved inside him anymore. Faith had left, quietly, like a guest who didn't want to disturb anyone on their way out. And with it went his peace. He tried to fight it the way he used to fight despair in prison: routine, repetition, discipline. He reread the scriptures that once gave him strength, but now every verse sounded like someone else's voice. He looked at the framed image of the Virgin that had once glowed in his cell, the very image that made the world call him chosen. But now it was just pigment and paper. He pressed his fingers against the frame and whispered, "Were you ever really here?" Silence answered. That silence became his constant companion, louder than voices, heavier than any cell wall. Then came the night that broke him. He had been giving a talk at a small parish in Louisiana, the kind of place where faith still filled the air like humidity. People lined up after his speech to touch his hand, to tell him he was proof that God still moved in the modern world. An old woman kissed his ring finger as if he were a priest. "You gave me hope," she said. He smiled, thanked her, drove away. And halfway down the interstate, he pulled over, stepped out of the car, and vomited. Not from sickness, from shame. He realized had been lying, not to them, but to himself. Every word he spoke about grace and destiny had been an attempt to keep his own miracle alive. Because if the miracle died, so did the meaning of everything had suffered. He drove aimlessly for hours through the storm, until the highway faded into dirt, and the dirt led to an abandoned chapel, half buried under weeds, roof collapsed, crucifix hanging sideways. Something pulled him inside. The pews were gone, the altar cracked, but the air felt alive. Like the ghosts of faith still lingered, waiting for someone foolish enough to listen. He knelt before the broken cross and said softly, "If you're still there, I need to know. I can't keep pretending." No answer. He stayed there for hours. The rain dripped through holes in the ceiling, forming muddy halos on the stone floor. Finally, he whispered, "Then maybe it was never you. Maybe it was just me, trying to survive." And that was the moment he broke, not the heroic kind of breaking that turns into a sermon later, but the real one. The kind where you feel the soul itself shatter. He stayed there all night. When the sun rose, the cross looked different, not glowing, not holy, just human. That's when it hit him. Maybe the miracle had never been supernatural. Maybe the Virgin hadn't come to save him. Maybe hope itself had worn her face that night, the last piece of his mother's love, given shape just long enough to keep him alive. He whispered, "I see it now." And then, for the first time in years, he laughed. A tired, broken laugh, the kind that sounds like breathing for the first time. Months passed. Michael vanished from the public eye. No speeches, no interviews, no miracles. He moved to New Mexico, to a cabin so far into the desert that even phone signal gave up halfway there. People called him reclusive. Some said had lost his faith. They were right and wrong. Every day, he woke to silence. No sermons, no applause. Just the hiss of wind sliding through the canyons and the crackle of sun over dust. The desert doesn't lie. It strips you down until all that's left is truth. In the beginning, he hated it. But slowly, it began to cleanse him. He noticed small things again, the sound of dry grass bending under his boots, the way dusk turned the sky into liquid gold, how even in the emptiness, there was rhythm. Maybe that was faith and not the fireworks of divine intervention, but the slow rhythm of survival. One morning, while walking near a dried riverbed, he found a dead bird of bones, feathers, nothing else. He picked it up gently and whispered, "You flew until you couldn't." Then he buried it. That night, he lit a single candle and watched it flicker. No prayers, no rituals, just the quiet crackle of wax melting. And for the first time in forever, he felt something warm inside. It wasn't revelation. It wasn't salvation. It was peace. A month later, a letter arrived from Carlos, the man he had once helped free. Carlos' handwriting was uneven, his words simple. "I still pray every night. Not because I'm sure God listens. Because I want to believe someone does. Come visit. I miss my friend." Michael stared at the letter for hours. Then he packed his bag and left the desert. When they finally met, Carlos looked older, took lines around his eyes, hair graying. But the moment they saw each other, the silence between them dissolved. They sat outside Carlos' small house, beers in hand, watching kids play soccer in the street. Carlos turned to him and said, "So tell me the truth. Do you still believe she came to you that night?" Michael smiled. "I believe something came. Maybe it was her. Maybe it was hope wearing her face. I don't know anymore. But it was enough." Carlos nodded slowly. "Sometimes I think that's all faith is, something that's just enough to keep you going one more day." Michael looked at the setting sun. "Yeah, maybe that's the only kind worth having." He returned to his workout, but this time, no cameras followed. He didn't preach about miracles. He didn't tell his story unless someone asked. He simply sat with people, listened, held hands. When a young man on death row asked, "Do you think God still cares about people like me?" Michael didn't answer with scripture. He just said, "He cared enough to send me here to listen." And somehow, that was enough. The miracle had changed form. It no longer glowed. It breathed in through kindness, through presence, through silence that didn't need filling. Years later, an interviewer tracked him down. They wanted to film a "Where Is He Now" documentary. Michael declined, politely, but before hanging up, he said, "You can tell them I stopped chasing heaven. I started finding it in people." That line never aired, but it became the truth he lived by. The night he died years later, quietly, in his sleep, they found a candle still burning on his bedside table. Next to it, a single note: "Faith isn't seeing light. It's learning to walk when you can't." And in that final flame, those who knew his story saw the full circle. The boy who once begged for a miracle had become one himself. Because sometimes the fire doesn't fall from the sky. It's born inside the broken, and it never goes out. It began with silence. The kind of silence that follows the last heartbeat, not cold or cruel, but vast. A silence that seemed to pause the world for a moment, as if it wanted to pay respect to a man who had once been forgotten, then found, then transformed. When Michael died, there were no headlines this time. No breaking news. No cameras flashing at his door. The world had already moved on, chasing new scandals, new saints, new miracles. But somewhere out there, in the quiet corners of the world he once touched, something stirred. A ripple. The first to feel it was Carlos. He got the call on a Tuesday morning. The voice on the other end simply said, "Has gone." For a long time, Carlos said nothing. He just sat at his kitchen table, the coffee cooling beside him, sunlight catching the edge of a photo on the wall, the two of them, sitting on that same porch years ago, laughing about how faith never really explains itself. He whispered, "You finally got your peace, brother." That night, he lit a candle and placed it by the window. Then another. Then another. By midnight, the glow from his small house spilled onto the street. Neighbors asked why. "For a friend," he said. "For someone who reminded me what mercy looks like." The next day, 3 other houses had candles too. Then 7. Then the whole block. No one planned it. They just felt it. And somewhere in that soft orange light, the echo began. Thousands of miles away, a woman named Jennifer Torres, once accused, once condemned, now free, found out through a letter sent by one of the volunteer chaplains who had known Michael. She read the words twice, her fingers trembling. He passed peacefully, candles still burning beside him. Jennifer closed her eyes and smiled through tears. She remembered the day Michael had visited her cell years ago, when Shed told him Shed made peace with dying for something she hadn't done. He hadn't argued, hadn't promised her miracles, had just said, "You won't face it alone." And somehow, that had been enough to keep her alive until the truth finally surfaced. Now, standing in her small apartment with her son, the one Shed lost and found again through years of pain, as she whispered, he kept his promise. That night, she told her boy about Michael. Not the legend, not the virgin story, but the man, kind, quiet, flawed. The kind who listened more than he spoke. Her son, only 12, asked, "So was he like a priest?" "No," she said. "He was just human. That's what made him holy." In the months that followed, small stories began to surface. An inmate in Arizona who had once written to Michael for advice started a reading group for other prisoners, using his letters as discussion topics. A nurse who had cared for him in his final years began volunteering at hospice centers, telling patients that faith doesn't have to fix things, sometimes it just helps you hold them. A journalist, once skeptical of Michael's miracle, found herself writing not about crime or politics anymore, but about redemption, small stories of ordinary kindness that somehow drew more readers than anything else Shed ever published. No one noticed the connection at first, but if you mapped it out, the prisons, the hospitals, the schools, the shelters, you'd see it, a web of compassion, spreading outward from a single life that refused to stay silent. Years later, one of those ripples became something bigger. A teacher in Chicago, named Ruth Delgado, discovered one of Michael's letters online. It had been shared and reshared across social media, scanned, translated, printed on walls. It read, "Maybe God doesn't speak through thunder. Maybe he whispers through people who refuse to stop caring." Ruth, who had grown tired of teaching kids who didn't believe in anything anymore, not in God, not in goodness, not in themselves, printed that quote and pinned it to her classroom wall. One morning, a student named Elijah asked her what it meant. "It means hope is something you wait for," she said. "It's something you give." That conversation turned into a project. The class started leaving anonymous notes of kindness around the city of bus stops, hospitals, homeless shelters. Simple words, "You matter. You're not alone. Someone still believes in you." They called it the Candle Project, after the story of the man who always kept one burning. Within a year, it spread beyond the school. Churches joined in, then universities, then prisons. The movement had no leader, no organization, just a message passed from one person to another: keep the candle burning. Meanwhile, somewhere in the archives of a forgotten news station, an intern found the old footage of Michael's first interview after his release. The tape was dusty, the colors fading. In it, Michael looked straight into the camera and said, "If a man can find light in a cell made for death, maybe there's nowhere on earth too dark for grace." The intern uploaded it online. Within weeks, it was everywhere. Millions of views, millions of comments. But the comments weren't about religion. They were about life. People shared their own stories of addiction, loss, failure, and how they'd found light again, not through miracles, but through each other. It was as if Michael's silence had finally found its voice, not in churches, but in people's hearts. 10 years after his death, a small chapel was built on the site of his old cabin in New Mexico. It wasn't grand, just stone, sand, and sky. Inside, there were no statues, no stained glass, no sermons. Only a single wooden bench and a plaque that read, "This place is for the broken, sick, breathe, begin again." Travelers came from everywhere, not because they wanted to worship, but because they wanted to remember how to feel. They called it the Chapel of Silence. And outside, near the entrance, stood a small candle, always lit, protected by glass. Locals said it never went out. Of course, science could explain it as solar panels, automatic timers. But believers didn't need an explanation. Because the flame had stopped being a symbol of heaven, it had become a symbol of us. One evening, years later, Carlos visited the chapel. He was older now, slower, but still carried the calm that Michael had taught him. He sat on the bench for a long time. Then, pulling a worn notebook from his coat, he opened to the first page, Michael's handwriting, faint but still readable. "No prayer goes unheard. Sometimes the answer is another human being." Carlos smiled. "You were right," he said softly. Then he left a note of his own, slipping it between the pages before placing the notebook on the altar. Your echo still reaches us. Outside, the desert wind carried that warmth across the plains. Somewhere far away, a teacher lit another candle. A child read another quote. A prisoner wrote another letter. And though no one spoke his name anymore, the world was fuller because he had lived. Maybe that's the truest miracle of all, and not that he saw light once, but that he became it for others. Because miracles aren't supposed to make us believe in heaven. They're meant to make us believe in each other. And in that sense, Michael never died. He just changed form. The candle still burns. The echo still moves. And the world, somehow, feels a little less dark. It had been 47 years since the man called Michael died. The world had changed 1,000 times over, faster, louder, more connected, and yet somehow lonelier than ever. Most people didn't remember his name anymore. They knew fragments, half-remembered quotes, songs inspired by him, a movie that had turned his life into a polished fable. Some thought he was a myth. Others swore he was a saint. But in the age of algorithms and information overload, truth had become just another version of belief. And that's where our story begins, not with faith, but with doubt. His name was Noah Reid, a 32-year-old journalist with more ambition than sleep and more cynicism than faith. He worked for The Atlas, a digital magazine that thrived on deconstructing myths, apolitical, historical, spiritual. His editor once called him the scalpel of modern journalism, a sharp, precise, and heartless. Noah didn't believe in miracles. He believed in patterns, in human error, in manipulation, and myth-making. To him, Michael was just another story that had grown too big to die. So when his editor pitched a feature called The Man Who Never Died, the true story behind the candle legend, Noah said yes immediately. Not because he cared, but because he wanted to tear it down. His first stop was New Mexico. The Chapel of Silence still stood, sun-bleached and wind-worn, surrounded by tourists and pilgrims with cameras. Inside, the candle still burned, a steady, unbroken, protected by glass. Noah stared at it, unimpressed. Solar-powered, he muttered under his breath. The caretaker, a soft-spoken woman named Leela, approached. "First time here. First and last," Noah said, flipping open his notebook. "I'm writing about the myth. The man who started all this, Michael. Did you ever know him?" She smiled faintly. "No one really knows him. But everyone who comes here carries a piece of him." He scribbled, "Cult psychology, transfer of identity, posthumous mythologizing." But then his eyes fell on something carved into the wood of the bench, or faded words, barely legible. "If you're here looking for proof, sit longer." He didn't. That night, he stayed in a small motel nearby. The walls were thin, the desert air humming through the vents. He opened his laptop, cross-referencing archives, testimonies, old footage. What he found didn't make sense. Michael's story was too clean, the timeline too consistent, the miracles too poetic, almost constructed, and the letters, hundreds of them scanned online, quoted endlessly, shared across generations. But there was one problem: the handwriting didn't match. Half were written by the same hand, the rest slightly different, subtle but real, a forgery, a continuation. He leaned back, the glow of the screen flickering across his face. For the first time, Noah wasn't sure what he wanted to prove. The next day, he met with an old man, Carlos' grandson, Mateo. He was a musician now, living quietly near Albuquerque. When Noah asked about the letters, Mateo smiled. "My grandfather used to say, the truth doesn't always wear one face." "Meaning?" Noah asked. "Meaning maybe it doesn't matter who wrote the words, only that they kept people alive." Noah frowned. "That's not truth. That's comfort." "Maybe," Mateo said. "But sometimes comfort saves more souls than truth ever did." Still unsatisfied, Noah kept digging. He visited prisons where Michael's letters had once circulated. He talked to teachers who ran candle projects, to families who claimed their lives had changed because of his message. But everywhere he went, the story grew murkier. Some swore Michael healed people. Others said he predicted things. Some said he never existed at all, that he was a metaphor, created by Carlos and a few others to inspire hope after the world lost faith. The journalist in Noah loved that theory. It was clean, rational, safe. But the man in him, the one who still remembered praying as a child over his dying mother and never getting an answer, felt something else. A quiet unease. Because even if the miracle was a lie, why did it still work? Weeks turned into months. The article changed shape. What began as exposing the candle myth became tracing the flame. And one night, while reviewing old video reels from a forgotten archive, Noah froze. There he was. Michael, not the saint from the films, not the polished legend, just an old man, frail, sitting on a hospital bed. The interviewer asked, "Do you believe you were chosen?" Michael laughed softly. "Chosen? No, I just stopped running." "Running from what?" "From believing I didn't matter." The interviewer was silent. Then Michael said something that stopped Noah's breath cold. "People think the miracle was me surviving. But it wasn't. The real miracle was that people cared enough to remember." The tape ended. Noah just sat there, the words echoing. Because that was exactly what he'd spent his life not doing, caring. A week later, he returned to the Chapel of Silence. This time, there were no tourists, just wind and sand. He sat on the bench, where those words were still carved. "If you're here looking for proof, sit longer." He did. Minutes passed. Then hours. Nothing happened. No divine whisper, no sign, no revelation. But something small did shift to stillness in his chest, a kind of peace he had felt since before life became a series of deadlines. And then, for no reason he could name, he lit a candle. Not because he believed, but because he wanted to. That night, Noah wrote his article, but it wasn't what his editor expected. He didn't debunk the legend. He didn't glorify it either. Instead, he wrote this: "I went to find the man who performed a miracle and found only people who refused to let goodness die." Maybe that's all a miracle ever is, the persistence of kindness in a world that forgets too easily. It went viral within days. Not because it was sensational, but because it was true in a quiet way. People shared it with captions like, "This is what faith feels like," or "Maybe we all carry the candle." And for the first time, Noah didn't check the numbers. He just watched the comments of stories of small kindnesses, forgiveness, reconnections. The echo had found him, too. Years later, after Noah's own death, someone found his journal among his belongings. Inside, a single page was bookmarked. On it, he had copied Michael's old words: "No prayer goes unheard. Sometimes the answer is another human being." And beneath it, in Noah's handwriting, "Sometimes the prayer is the human being." By then, the world had forgotten both names, Michael and Noah. But the candle still burned. The chapel still stood. The letters still circulated. And every time someone reached out to help another, whether in faith or in doubt, the miracle repeated itself. Not in light or in thunder, but in the simple act of remembering that goodness, too, can be contagious. And so the story lived on, not as proof, but as presence. Not as legend, but as legacy. Because the miracle was never about one man who found God. It was about all the people who found each other afterward. The man who forgot the miracle had, in the end, become part of it. And maybe that's how every miracle ends, and not with belief, but with belonging. It began, as all endings do, with silence. 50 years after the article, the man who forgot the miracle reshaped how the world spoke about faith. Something unexpected happened. People didn't stop believing. They stopped arguing. And that might have been the greatest miracle of all. For centuries, faith had been a weapon, a wall, a reason to divide. But now, slowly, quietly, the idea of the candle began to spread beyond religion. It wasn't about God, or proof, or the supernatural. It was about presence. About the light we pass to each other when darkness feels endless. In schools, teachers used it to teach empathy. In hospitals, nurses left candles, real or electric, by the beds of those who had no visitors. In prisons, men and women drew candles on their cell walls, small reminders that redemption was still possible. No one knew who started these traditions. No one owned them. And maybe that's why they lasted. Because the moment something pure becomes branded, it dies. A documentary filmmaker named Sarah Lane decided to capture it all, the last living witnesses of the candle movement, the descendants of the people Michael once touched, and those unknowingly carrying his light forward. Her project was simple. Her question impossible. What happens when belief outlives the believer? She interviewed hundreds of people. An old teacher in Brazil who had a photo of Michael on her classroom wall. A nurse in Poland who lit a candle every night for her patients. A teenage boy in Korea who had a tattoo of a flame and said, "It reminds me not to give up." When Sarah asked him if he knew who started it, he shrugged. "No idea," he said. "But whoever it was, thank you." Sarah's film The Candle, a story without an author, became an unexpected phenomenon. It didn't show miracles. It showed moments. People helping strangers. Letters being rewritten and passed on. Children lighting candles for each other after fights, whispering it's okay. And when the film ended, the screen faded to black, no credits, no sponsors, just the faint sound of wind and a line of text dedicated to the man who once believed he didn't matter. Audiences didn't applaud. They sat in silence. Then, one by one, someone in the theater would light their phone flashlight, the tiny symbol of the candle. And soon, whole cinemas glowed in gentle light. Somewhere, far from the noise of the modern world, the Chapel of Silence still stood. The flame had been burning for over a century now, though no one could explain how. Scientists tested it. Engineers examined the mechanisms. But no one could find a power source. The caretakers had changed many times. But every generation left the same note for the next: if you're here looking for proof, sit longer. Sarah, now older and gray-haired, visited the chapel during the final stages of her documentary series. The desert was quiet. The same bench where Michael once sat was still there, its wood worn smooth by countless visitors. She sat down, holding her camera on her lap, and whispered, "Michael, if you were ever real, thank you." A wind swept through the chapel. The candle flickered, just once, and then steadied. She smiled, knowing she wouldn't include that part in the film. Some things were meant to remain unrecorded. But not everyone believed. A new generation, raised in the era of data and deepfakes, began to question again. Was any of this real? They asked on forums. Maybe the candle story was an early social experiment, an emotional virus. Some even claimed Noah Reid never existed. It became an academic debate, then a digital conspiracy, then a cultural war, because humans, as history proved, don't know how to let peace last. But even then, even as hashtags fought hashtags, someone, somewhere, would still light a candle quietly. Not for attention, not for validation, just because it felt right. And that's when something strange began to happen. In 2098, during a massive power outage that hit most of the northern hemisphere, a live feed from the Chapel of Silence went dark. For the first time in over a century, the world couldn't see the candle. People panicked, millions refreshing their screens, desperate to know if it was still burning. The outage lasted 12 hours. When the feed returned, the camera flickered back to life. And there it was, the flame, steady and untouched. But something new was visible behind it. On the wall, faintly illuminated by the candle's glow, were words no one remembered carving: "If the light dies, be the next one." The world changed again. That sentence became a motto for an entire generation. It wasn't about waiting for miracles anymore. It was about becoming them. Children learned to say it before bedtime. Corporations adopted it for social good campaigns. Governments even used it during disasters: "Be the next one." For once, the world's most viral message wasn't born out of outrage or fear, but out of quiet hope. Sarah Lane died before her final documentary released. In her will, she asked for a single thing: to have her ashes scattered near the chapel. The new caretaker, a young woman named Emma, fulfilled her wish. As she poured the ashes into the wind, she noticed something resting beneath the bench: an old, worn notebook, the pages yellowed with time. Inside was a name on the first page: Noah Reid. The last entry read simply, "The story isn't mine anymore. It belongs to whoever keeps it alive." Emma looked up, eyes glistening. She wasn't religious. She didn't believe in miracles. But she felt something sacred in that moment, the weight of continuity. She placed the notebook beside the candle. And when she walked away, for a brief second, the flame flared higher as if recognizing her. Years passed. The chapel became a World Heritage Site, then a pilgrimage spot for people of all beliefs: atheists, Buddhists, Christians, Muslims, and those who called themselves simply human. Scholars from different religions studied the candle movement and found something unprecedented in not a shared belief, but a shared emotion. One theologian described it perfectly: it is not faith in something. It is faith as something, an act of choosing light over indifference. By the mid-2100s, artificial intelligence had rewritten much of human culture. People talked to machines more than to each other. Empathy was a word, not a habit. And yet, somehow, the candle remained even in the virtual world. In digital spaces, people left virtual candles on memorial pages. In augmented reality games, players had to protect the light as a symbol of teamwork. The flame adapted because humanity did. And maybe that's what made it divine. In 2121, a research team studying climate migration discovered something extraordinary. Refugee camps lit by renewable lamps began to form circular layouts unconsciously mimicking the design of the Chapel of Silence. When asked why, one of the displaced said, "It makes people feel safe. The light's in the middle, like it's watching over us." That was all. No theology, no ideology, just a human instinct to gather around warmth. The same instinct that built tribes, cities, civilizations. The same instinct that made one dying man light a candle 100 years ago to remind himself that he still mattered. And that's where the story ends, or maybe where it begins again. Because the candle was never about Michael, or Noah, or faith, or miracles, or stories. It was about the human echo. The sound of one person's hope vibrating quietly through centuries, passed from hand to hand, name to name, until no one remembers where it started. Maybe that's how eternity works. Not in heaven, not in fire, but in memory. If you stand in the chapel today, whether in person or through a holographic feed, the inscription is still there. If you're here looking for proof, sit longer. And beneath it, etched faintly by someone unknown, another line glows in the candlelight. If you found peace, pass it on. It started with a storm. Not a biblical one, no floods, no thunder from the heavens, but a quiet, relentless rain that blurred the horizon into a single shade of gray. Somewhere inside that storm, a train moved through the valley, its windows flickering like the last neurons of a dying mind. Inside one of those windows sat a woman named Elena Morrow, 42, historian, skeptic, and unwilling pilgrim. She hadn't come searching for faith. She'd come to disprove it. For the past 2 years, Elena had been writing a book titled The Candle Illusion. Her premise was simple: every miracle in history could be explained through psychology, coincidence, or the desperate human need to make meaning out of chaos. But lately, something had started to bother her, a pattern she couldn't explain. Everywhere she went to research the candle movement, she found the same thing: people changed. Not in doctrine, not in words, but in presence. A soldier who stopped drinking. A politician who resigned to work in a shelter. A child who forgave the man who killed her father. No proof, no reason, just change. And that, more than miracles, scared Elena the most. When she arrived at the edge of the desert, she expected ruins. Instead, she found the chapel still standing there, small, unadorned, alive. The caretaker, Emma, was gone. A young boy greeted her instead. His name was Levi, maybe 12 years old, barefoot, with dust on his face and a look of steady wonder that adults lose somewhere along the way. "Are you here to see the light?" he asked. Elena hesitated. "I'm here to see the truth," he smiled. "It's the same thing, Mom." Inside, the candle burned as it always had. A soft, living thing in a world built on noise. Elena set up her recorder, her notebook, her skepticism. She measured the airflow, checked for vents, examined the wick. Everything seemed ordinary to ordinary. But as she sat in the silence, something strange happened. The hum of the desert faded. The clicking of her pen slowed. And for the first time in years, she realized she was breathing in rhythm with something that wasn't her own pulse. The candle's flame moved not from wind, but from memory. Hours passed. The recorder filled with silence. At dusk, the boy returned. "Did you find your proof?" Elena exhaled. "Not yet." He pointed to the wall. "Then sit longer." She laughed softly. "You sound like you've said that before." "My grandpa told me," he said. "Said it's what the first man wrote." The first man. Michael. The name landed like thunder in her chest. She hadn't told him why she was there. She hadn't mentioned the name at all. "How do you know that?" The boy shrugged. "Everybody here knows Michael. As the one who lit it. My mom says he wasn't an angel. Just somebody who remembered not to quit." That night, the storm reached the chapel. Lightning cracked in the distance, and rain swept across the desert like the tears of a forgotten god. Elena stayed inside, watching the candle's reflection tremble across the walls. She thought of the people she'd met, and those whose lives had been quietly rebuilt by a story she'd intended to bury. And for the first time, she asked herself a question she'd avoided her whole life: what if God was never a person, but a process? The thought terrified her, because if that was true, then there were no excuses left. No miracles to wait for. No divine intervention to hope for. Just us. Morning came quietly. The storm had washed the desert clean. Elena packed her things and prepared to leave. Before she did, she left her notebook open on the bench of the same one Michael once used and wrote a single line. If proof means control, then I choose wonder. She closed it, placed it beside the candle, and walked away. But as she reached the doorway, the boy called after her, "You forgot your book." She turned. "Keep it. Maybe someday you'll write the next chapter." Levi grinned. "Maybe I already am." Years later, that same boy, now grown, would become a teacher. He'd tell his students not about faith, but about focus. Not about miracles, but about the discipline of kindness. And on the first day of every class, he'd light a small candle and say, "This is the symbol of God." It's a reminder of choice. Because light doesn't care what you believe in. It just wants to be used. Some students laughed. Some filmed it. Most forgot. But one didn't. A girl named Ruth, whose parents were scientists and didn't believe in anything they couldn't prove. She'd grow up, build satellites, and launch machines that could skin the edges of galaxies. And one day, when asked what she hoped to find, she'd say, "Not God. Just something that reminds me of that candle." The universe, as it turned out, was filled with light and tiny signals, billions of years old, still traveling across time. Not fast enough to reach back to their origins, not slow enough to stop. Somewhere in those waves, in that ancient glow, was the echo of every human whisper that ever asked for meaning. And if you listened long enough, you could almost hear it, the sound of billions of souls saying, in unison, "If the light dies, be the next one." The rest of the story belongs to whoever hears it next. Maybe to you, listening now. Maybe to someone who hasn't been born yet. Because the God that Michael once begged for in his cell was never up there, beyond the stars. He was here in the breath between doubt and kindness, in the pause between pain and choice. God, it seems, was never the author. He was the echo. And the echo still speaks. The desert sleeps in silence again. Wind moves across the sand like a soft breath, erasing footprints, smoothing the memory of everything that once burned here. But the chapel still stands. Not because it was built to last, it wasn't. Its walls are cracked, its roof leans, and yet it remains. Inside, the air smells of dust, wax, and time. The candle is still there, not the same one, but one lit from its flame, again and again, by hands that never met. No plaque, no sermon, just a single word carved into the wood beside it. Continue. Some nights, travelers stop by. They never plan to. The place isn't on any map, but the lost have always had better instincts than the found. A trucker once stopped here after his headlights died in the middle of nowhere. He said later he didn't know why he walked toward the faint orange light in the distance. He just did. He sat there for an hour, said nothing, and when he left, he quit drinking. He didn't call it a miracle. He just said it felt like being remembered. Years pass like dust storms. The world keeps spinning faster, louder, more artificial every year. People argue online about truth and power, about who's right and who deserves to be heard. But somewhere, quietly, the story of the candle still circulates. Not as religion, not as doctrine, as rumor, as a whisper people tell when everything else stops working. They say it started with a man who broke and built himself again from nothing. They say he didn't preach, he listened. They say he found God in the silence and then taught others how to hear it. No one knows his real name anymore. Some call him Michael, some just call him the Quiet Man. But the story doesn't need his name. It only needs to be told. On the 100th year since the first lighting, a group of students came across an old archived fragments of letters, recordings, and journal pages, all signed with the same initials, M.S. They didn't know what to make of it. No theology, no miracles, just questions. Questions about power, fear, forgiveness, and the strange hunger that makes us human. One of the students, a girl with headphones around her neck, decided to publish them online. She titled the page, "The Candle Dialogues." Within a week, it went viral. Not because of answers, but because of how human the questions were. Soon, people began lighting candles again. Not as worship, as reminders. Reminders that even in a world made of glass and noise, warmth still matters. Hospitals lit them for the dying. Schools lit them for peace. Even prisons, sometimes, lit them for memory. One warden was asked by a reporter why he allowed it. He said, because maybe if they learn to protect a flame, they'll learn not to destroy each other. And somewhere, deep in the archives of an old monastery, a forgotten recording was found. It was nearly erased, its tape warped, the voice faint. But when restored, one could hear a man speaking softly, tired, honest, free. "If you ever find this," the voice said, "don't make a temple out of my words. Don't kneel. Don't follow. Just remember, if you don't need permission to be kind. The world's full of people waiting for a sign. Be it." Then the recording clicked off. No name, no date, just silence. Centuries later, after cities have risen and fallen, after even the stars we know have burned out, there will still be light somewhere. Not the old flame, not the candle, but light born from the same choice. Because every time someone chooses to care when it's easier not to, the story continues. Every time someone forgives the unforgivable, the echo grows. And if one day the last human heart goes quiet, maybe that echo will still travel through the dust of the universe, through forgotten time, until it lands in a place where silence begins again. And maybe there, the first spark will rise once more. They will call it coincidence. They will call it hope. They will call it science. But if you listen closely, beneath all the noise, you might still hear it, that quiet, familiar whisper, the one that's been with us since the first fire, since the first breath, since the first act of mercy in a cruel world. And it says only this: keep the light alive. Fade to black. The sound of a single match striking. Then a silence.